Good afternoon. My name is Ben Dudley. I'm the Director of Mainers for Clean Energy Jobs. Happy to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon on Hydro-Quebec's contribution to greenhouse gas reductions. Happy to co-sponsor this webinar with Hydro-Quebec. This is the fourth in our series of webinars on the subject on matters related to the proposed New England Clean Energy Connect transmission corridor. Mainers for Clean Energy Jobs is a coalition of businesses, professional associations, labor unions, and environmental leaders formed to advocate in support of this important clean energy project. Our agenda today is to hear from our presenters for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll do Q&A for the remaining time in our hour. And just instructions on how to ask a question. At the bottom of your screen, there should be a button labeled Q&A. And if you click on that, you'll be able to type your questions. And then when the question time comes, I will take your questions and give them to our presenters in the order that they were asked. Today's webinar is a companion piece to last week's webinar, which was on the greenhouse gas profile of the energy that is developed by Hydro-Quebec in their reservoirs. We're going to jump right in now with our first presenter, Gary Sutherland. Gary has been with Hydro-Quebec since 2007, working in public affairs, business development, and as a media spokesperson in the generation, transmission, and export fields. In 2019, he was named team leader for the company's external relations team. Gary, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ben. Very happy to be here out of the confinement of our respective homes. A little bit of a strange way to reach out to speak to people, but seems to be that that's going to be our normal situation for some time. I'm very happy to be able to speak to you a little bit about Quebec's generating fleet and some other issues that are involved in that, and to be presenting alongside my colleague Louis. So I'm going to be going through a certain number of slides that are looking at the kind of situation that we have in Quebec. What do we use to generate our electricity, and what do we do with that electricity on our grid? So first of all, just a little bit of context. Here's a map of Quebec, and this is a way that we don't usually see things just because of the way that maps are set up. A form that I think everybody here that's on this webinar recognizes quite well. But if we took Quebec and we actually superposed it over top of the United States, this is what you would see. So we have a very vast territory, however, that is inhabited by relatively few people. So there's only 8.5 million people in all of Quebec, despite this large land mass. And 80% of our population lives along a band that's right along the St. Lawrence Valley, all the way down south in Quebec, which means that we have a great deal of territory that has a very, very low population density. And this is one of the reasons that we are able to do some of the things that we do in terms of hydropower development here in Quebec. This is also a territory that is covered to a very vast extent by water. About 22% of Quebec is covered in about 500,000 lakes and about 4,500 rivers. Out of all of these, Hydro-Quebec has used 75 rivers for hydropower generation, either directly or we have sometimes joined rivers together. One part of the flow will be flowing into another river's basin and into a reservoir. This means that we have developed a system that has made us, in the last few years, the largest renewable energy producer in North America. We generate about half of Canada's hydropower generation, and the company does the full production line. So we generate that electricity, we do the transmission component, and distribute it to our final clients, either within Quebec or into export markets, such as New England. We have one shareholder, Hydro-Quebec. It's the government of Quebec, which means that every year our company, which has a commercial vocation, it means that it has a commercial objective, will have a profit, and that profit is sent to the government of Quebec to go into the general coffers of the government, and that pays for a lot of our social programs, education, health, etc. The big figure on the right is one that we're very, very proud of. 99.8% of the energy on our grid is clean and renewable, and there's a portion of that, of course, that is available for export. We are very close to 100, not quite at 100, because we do import some power from neighboring markets at various times of the year. And that power, we look at its origin, we look at the type of energy that has been generating that electricity, and we deduct that, of course, from the total that we have. So what is this 0.2% that's missing? It's a combination of fossil fuels that come mainly from the Ontario grid or sometimes from New York, and nuclear power. So nuclear is not added into this. That makes up the 0.2% that is left. This is a map of our system. What you see here, the blue dots are major generating stations. Anything over 245 megawatts is on here. We have 62 generating stations in total across the province. Some of them are smaller than 245. You don't see those in the map, but you see the larger ones. The orange lines is the backbone of our transmission system, and I'll talk a little bit more about transmission in a few minutes. The orange squares are substations on our network that links all of the transmission system together. So all of our system is linked together in what looks a little bit like a spider web. All of the generating stations linked through the transmission lines and through the substations together. Out of our generating stations, about 1/3 of them are what we call reservoir stations. So that has a reservoir, it has a dam associated with it and a reservoir behind it. 2/3 are run of the river, which means that these are generating stations placed on a river that basically turbine or generate electricity from all the water that is flowing down the river. There's no reservoir holding the water back. That is how we're set up in terms of our capacity. In terms of what actually is outputted from our system at the end of the year, as far as energy is concerned, you can actually look at it in exactly the opposite way. So out of the reservoir stations, they're the ones that actually produce 2/3 of our electricity, and the run-of-the-river stations produce 1/3. This is because of the reservoir stations, and we have 28 large reservoirs that are located right across Quebec, tend to be larger stations, and those, of course, are the ones that are turbining really when we need the energy to come. Those are the ones that we can control, and they have flexibility because they have water stored behind the dam. Across our system, in total, we have a storage capacity of 177 terawatt hours. A very abstract figure that is a little bit difficult sometimes to get your head around. To give you a little bit of a comparison, all of New England, so the 6 New England states, use in electricity about 115 to 120 terawatt hours for an entire year. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the size of the reservoir storage that we have here in Quebec. 37,000 megawatts of installed capacity in hydro. And in addition to that, on our network, we have another 10,000 megawatts that are under what we call PPAs, power purchase agreements. Those are with other producers, private producers. They could be hydro, they can be wind. We do have a significant portion of wind on our system, about 4,000 megawatts, and some biomass and some biogas. This is maybe a little bit of repetition for those of you who participated in our webinar on greenhouse gases, but I did want to bring it up very quickly for those who were not present that day. This is a life cycle analysis on the kilowatt hour. So what we are looking at here is actual grams of equivalent CO2, so carbon dioxide, that are emitted by various types of power generation. So you see the 5 on the left side of your screen are renewable sources, and renewable or clean sources, I should say, because nuclear is included in there. So those are the low carbon sources. The 3 on the right side of your screen are thermal generation. I think what jumps out at you first of all from this graph is that there's a big difference between the 5 first and the latter 3. This is a difference that's really an order of magnitude. The thermal generating sources do produce a lot more greenhouse gases. And if we look at natural gas, it's about 50 times what hydropower produces. The second thing, and if we kind of move in and we focus a little bit on the hydropower here, these are figures that come from actual measurements on hydropower in Quebec. These are not figures that are coming out of a study that was done in another area of the world. These are really pertinent to the situation that we have in Quebec. And why am I saying this? It's because hydropower is a very site-specific technology as far as the carbon emissions coming out of it. It really depends where that hydropower is located. So you're not going to get the same carbon profile if you were in a boreal region in Quebec. And that means cold temperatures. It means very low growing cycles for vegetation. You're going to get a completely different carbon profile if you look at, for example, the Amazon basin in Brazil, where you have high temperatures, you have a lot of growth year in, year out, and you're getting a lot of organic material that is getting into the water and decomposing. That's simply not the case in our boreal regions, where, first of all, trees and vegetation don't grow quickly. And secondly, the cold water temperature means that there's much less bacterial action in the water to decompose materials. So keep in mind that those two figures are really concerned or pertaining to Quebec hydropower. Second thing, if I just want to concentrate on the low carbon solutions here, there's a difference between the ones that I'm highlighting here in green, which are continuous outputting options. So what does that mean? That means that we can actually control the output of these options because we can turn off and turn on easily the generating stations. Hydro is in that case, nuclear is as well. This is in contrast to the other two on your screen, wind and solar, which we call intermittent output options. So what does that mean? It means when the wind is blowing, that's great, we get generation, or when the sun is shining. When the wind slows down or the sun is no longer shining, goes behind the clouds, we don't get that same output. So given that we are looking at an electricity grid that has a demand throughout the day, and that demand fluctuates depending on what people are doing throughout the day, we need a system that is able to respond to those fluctuations during the day and really follow the electricity demand and what we call ramp up when we need more electricity or ramp down when we don't need quite so much. Hydro-Québec has been adding to its fleet. This is the last build-out that we have had in Quebec, build-out that started back in 2003, and that will continue up until 2021. We're actually constructing right now the last generating station on the Romaine River, which you see all the way on the right of your screen here. It will be brought online in 2021, and that will finish this phase of build-out that will have brought, at the end of the day, about 5,000 megawatts of additional generating capacity onto our grid. So this is one of the reasons that today we have a great deal of surplus on our system, and those surpluses that can be made available to clients in New England, clients in other US Northeast markets. Moving along, what you see in front of you is a history of our exports from 1969 right up to just the last year that I had data for, so 2018. This is in terawatt hours. Okay, so if you look at the beginning, we were at a very, very low level. This has fluctuated a great deal over these last 50 years or so. This depends on a whole lot of things. This depends on, first of all, what are the markets looking for? And Louis will be going into that aspect in the second part of this presentation in some detail. Of course, a great deal of this graph is at a time when we didn't have the organized market structure that we do today. Markets were deregulated in the late 90s. So quite often, quite a bit of what you see here is related to some long-term contracts that we had with, for example, New York, or in some cases, New England. Now, I'd like to just put another layer over top of this map. These gray areas that you see on your screen represent times when Hydro-Québec was very actively building out its system. So if you look at the last one, the one that's on the far right of your screen from 2003 up until the present, this is the build-out that I was just talking about. Now, in each of these periods, what do you see? You see that there's a build-out, fine, and there's an increase in how much we're exporting. So I'm going to make a distinction between the first three phases of this and then the last one that I'm going to talk about afterwards. Throughout these first three phases, what was going on? Well, we were having increases in electricity demand here in Quebec. And so what we would do is look at what we thought that increase was going to be, but project it out a good 25 years because it does take us a long time to build a hydropower plant. And we would make sure that we would have the resources that we need on the hydropower side built out to be able to meet that demand when that demand materialized. So this is why you see this kind of interesting trend
1971, we began building out, but of course the demand was not there right away. The demand comes gradually over a certain period of time. So what do we do with the surplus energy? We export it to markets that need it. Then you see the end of the construction period, and there's a little bit of a dip in exports. What does that correspond to? That's the fact that Quebec load has basically caught up with the generating capacity. And you see that maybe quite remarkably in the second phase. So if you look at 1979 to 1985, we have a gradual increase, then we have a drop off. So that was Quebec load that was catching up, if you like, with the generating capacity. That was the case in the first three periods here. As of about 2003, different situation because energy policy here in Quebec changed. And what we did in the province was that we said, fine, today energy markets are deregulated. We're going into a new phase of our development. What we're going to say is that everything that we've developed in terms of hydropower resources, we're going to say that that is available for Quebec load. And we put a name on that, and it's called the Heritage Pool. So these are facilities that were built up over a number of different years to especially serve Quebec load. And then we said from this moment on, anything else that we build will be available for a whole lot of different purposes, but will not be committed solely to Quebec load. So Quebec load can fluctuate. It can go above that heritage pool, that volume of energy that is dedicated amongst our energy resources for domestic load. But if it does, above and beyond that limit, we have to go out onto external markets and buy that energy at market price. So what does this do at the end of the day? It makes, once again, this increasing trend where we increase the volume of our exports, but we're not going to see a corresponding decrease afterwards because there's going to be no question of Quebec load catching up. Quebec load, if it does increase, we'll have to go somewhere else to get that energy. So this also makes a little bit of maneuvering room, if you like, for us to be able to export more to our markets and to be able to commit that energy over a longer period of time. So what this does at the end of the day is that it secures a volume of energy that we can commit to long-term contracts on the export markets. When we export, we actually avoid greenhouse gas emissions in our export markets. My colleague Louis will be going into the mechanics of how this works a little bit later, but I did want to throw a couple of figures out to you. So these are figures from, once again, 2018. Our exports that year avoided 8 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. That's the equivalent of taking about 2 million cars off the roads. This is because we displace thermal generation in those markets. Basically, we're replacing that thermal generation. It's not being used during that time. And so there are lower levels of emissions that are coming in. Our transmission grid. So great to have the generation resource and the water to be able to propel that generation resource, but we have to get it from point A to point B. Bringing back the map here, you can see, once again, our production areas are the ones that are located in the La Grande complex up here, and then on this side of the St. Lawrence. Those are quite far away from our load, which is all concentrated down here in southern Quebec and then into export markets like New York and New England. So we have to bring all that energy down through our transmission grid. To give you an idea, from Montreal to Radisson up here in the La Grande complex, it's about 600 miles as the crow flies. Beautiful trip for anyone to do. There is a road that goes up there. It's a nice 16-hour drive from Montreal to Radisson. And we do welcome visitors in our installations up there, and there is infrastructure for you to be able to either stay in a hotel or camp. This is my tourism Radisson little sales pitch, but it is a beautiful way to see some of the countryside in Quebec and to see some of our generating stations. This network is one of the biggest in North America, about 20,000 miles of high voltage lines. We do put a lot of investment into this network. We add a lot of technology year in, year out to reduce line losses, to make the system more and more stable and more reliable. A lot of technology going into this. This is a system that's a little bit different from the one that you have in terms of transmission. I think in New England and Maine, you're on a 315 or a 345 kilovolt grid, we had to increase the voltage on our grid because of the distance involved. So to avoid line losses and to decrease the number of lines that we would actually have to build. So we have 735 kilovolt technology that came about in the 1960s. And one more thing that I'd like to point out on this, the line that I've just highlighted is a direct current line that goes all the way from our generating facilities in La Grande down into the Boston load pocket. This line was the last interconnection that we have built from the Quebec grid into the US Northeast markets, and it was built over 30 years ago. So we are working today for our export markets on a system, an infrastructure that is 30 plus years old. With that, I will pass this over to my colleague, Louis.
And I will just give a couple words of introduction for Louis. Thank you, Gary. That was excellent. Louis Vézina is the head of the Planning and Expertise Unit at Hydro-Quebec's trading floor. He oversees planning of the company's sales of energy, capacity, and environmental attributes. Louis also monitors fuel markets and manages the trading floor's regulatory team. Louis, I'm happy to pass the microphone over to you, and thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
And
Can
Louis,
you hear me well?
yes, and we're looking at your presenter view. You want to click on those three dots and give us the masquer le mode présentateur.
Yeah.
There you go.
You see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you, Ben, and hello, everyone. Great pleasure to be with you today to talk about our Hydro-Quebec's export activities. I've been making a lot of those presentations over the years, but normally it's in front of a live audience. It's a first time for me to do a webcast. It's a bit of a weird feeling to be talking to my computer, but I hope that I'll manage to convey the information as clearly as I believe I managed to do when people are in front of me. When we talk about, or when we consider our export activities or export activities for a company like ours, you've got three elements that condition what you can do in terms of exports. First of all, you do need to have surplus generation in excess of your domestic commitment. And I think that what Gary explained to you earlier on just showed that we do have plenty of supply. We've got plenty of surplus energy that we can sell to our neighboring markets. Second element that you need is that you need markets around you that have themselves a need for competitively priced energy to supplement the generation that they can provide in their own markets. And there again, our markets around us do have the need for more. And also you may need, or you can also need entities in those markets that are ready to procure for low carbon energy, and low carbon energy like the one that we supply. And those conditions need to be there for to be able to realize your export sales. And the other very important element that you need that will condition your exports is that you may have surplus generation to sell. You may have markets that do want to get more generation from you. But of course, what you need is to have sufficient intertie capacity to deliver that excess energy into those markets. So I will touch on those three elements in my presentation and talk about how NESEC fits in that picture. Now, when we look at our four neighboring markets, the main markets in which we export our electricity, if we start with the Ontario market, Ontario is characterized by the presence of a lot of base load, low emitting generation. 61% of its energy has been supplied by its nuclear fleet last year, and it's complemented by hydro generation. So actually, you've got nearly 90% of the generation that comes from low emitting generation. And you've got on top of that wind generation available. They've got over 3,000 megawatts of wind generation available. And that generation is mainly base load. So that means that it is dispatched almost every hour of the year. And the other characteristic of the Ontario market is that a lot of that generation has been contracted for by the Ontario government over the last few years, or over the many years. And that creates a situation where the residual competitive market, where we sell our electricity, is somewhat very limited because Ontario's got already a lot of clean energy and a lot of low priced energy. Now, if you look at New Brunswick, the other Canadian province next to us, New Brunswick has got a different fuel mix. Actually, it is dominated by thermal generation, but it does have generation coming from one nuclear station, Point Lepreau, and from renewable energy. They do have some wind power as well. New Brunswick's got enough generation to meet its load. However, it's got some very expensive generation, thermal generation, so it's expensive and of course carbon emitting. So New Brunswick does need some supply to complement or supplement their generation, and that's why we are selling power to New Brunswick every year. But that demand depends on what New Brunswick needs. Year in, year out, we do supply around 2 or 3 terawatt hours of energy to New Brunswick, and we signed a contract recently that was made public earlier this year, whereby we undertook to supply New Brunswick with over 2 terawatt hour a year over the next 20 years. Actually, the total volume, I think, for the next 20 years is 47 terawatt hours. So New Brunswick was willing to secure that supply from us, and that's why we signed that contract, because they do want to have our energy to be able to run less of their thermal generation. Now, if we look at New York State, which is one of our major markets as well, New York can be seen as not only one grid, but could be seen as 2 subgrids, actually. There's a big difference in the energy profile in upstate New York than the one in downstate New York. In upstate New York, there's a lot of zero emitting generation available. They have their nuclear fleet that is located along the Great Lakes. They do have hydropower, and they do have also a lot of wind power that has been built over recent years. So over 87% of their generation upstate comes from low emitting sources. When you look at downstate New York, however, picture is totally different. Around Manhattan, New York City, and Long Island, most of the energy that is being supplied there comes from thermal generation or from fossil fuel. And the problem for New York is that they have a lot of clean energy or low emitting energy upstate, but they don't have enough transmission capacity to bring the power from upstate to downstate. There is a constraint in the middle of the, this is represented by a transmission constraint in the middle of the states that's called central-east. And because there's a limited amount of energy that can be transmitted from upstate to downstate, that explains why, even though there's a lot of clean energy upstate, they still have to run a lot of fossil fuel to meet the load downstate. 2 things to say there as well is that our exports into the New York market do sink in upstate New York. So somehow our clean energy is competing with the clean energy or low emitting energy that's already available in upstate New York. And at times now what we're seeing is that in fact our energy in some hours runs the risk of displacing renewable or low emitting energy already in place in New York. The other point is that what New York is looking at is the possibility of maybe improving its transmission infrastructure to bring more power to downstate New York. And a project like the Champlain-Hudson Power Express project that could link Quebec all the way to and New York City through going through Lake Champlain and the Hudson River would bring an element of solution to this congestion on the transmission network that is costing a lot in terms of carbon emission in downstate New York. So there are discussions on this project, and we'll see how it will conclude. Now, looking at New England, and we'll focus on New England. New England has a special profile compared with the other markets, is that you can see that more than 50% of its generation comes from thermal generation, actually, carbon emitting generation. So 49% in 2018 came from gas generation, and a little bit from coal and oil. And that's a big change from what the situation was 20 years ago, when only 15% of the generation came from natural gas. But that's because over the years, a lot of baseload generation came offline. Some nuclear stations were closed down, and some coal stations were also closed down. And that created a situation where New England is more and more relying on the supply of natural gas and on gas generation to meet its load. And that situation is also creating a special situation in New England, is that when you look at the fuel mix on an annual basis, as I said, half of the generation comes from natural gas. But there's a particular case in the winter when temperatures go down, when the heating load goes up, and there's a higher need for natural gas for heating homes and other buildings, then the natural gas network gets congested. There's not enough capacity to bring enough gas to meet the heating demand and provide the gas necessary to generate electricity for the gas generators. So that's a situation that has been developing over time. The greater reliance on natural gas has created this situation. And there's been calls for increasing the capacity on the natural gas network in New England, but those calls didn't lead to any significant build out over the last few years. And I don't expect that to change over the next few years or the next several years, mainly because, this would have a major impact also on the GHG emissions in New England. Now, that problem is also, or that situation is also creating a lot of volatility in terms of energy prices or electricity prices in New England, because when demand for gas goes up, the price goes up as well, and the cost of dispatching electricity generated with natural gas goes up, and this translates into higher prices in winter. So you can see this graph here that tracks the price in New England over several years. And you can see those spikes in winter. You can see that big spikes, for example, in 2013-14, which corresponds to the polar vortex. But it has spikes as well in 14 and 15 and 17 and 18. And this is all due to the fact that New England relies more and more on natural gas to produce electricity, and that creates problems in the winter. In fact, the problems is important enough for the ISO New England, the Independent System Operator of New England, to have put that issue that it sees as a reliability issue at the top of its list of concerns. Because, as we said, the constraints on the natural gas network creates difficulties and a reliability issue in terms of electricity generation. And that was recognized by the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources as well. It did recognize that the over-reliance on natural gas increased the utilization of higher priced and more carbon intensive fuel. That includes oil, and that includes also imported liquefied natural gas. And so therefore that creates a problem in terms of pricing. That creates also problems for reliability. And it also recognized that if it become impossible, and it seems to be very difficult to increase the gas pipeline network to bring more gas into New England, there are alternatives to that. And one alternative is, instead of building new pipelines to bring gas, we can build new entities or electricity entities to bring more baseload clean energy into New England. And that's what NESEC would be doing. And that's how the NESEC project would mitigate these challenges. So now that, now that I've talked about the conditions in the different markets that we're facing or we're delivering to, let's look at the third element of that condition our exports. And let's look at the transmission capacity that we have to effectuate our exports in our markets. You can see that if we start, not necessarily in order of how they appear in this table, but let's talk about Ontario. We've got 8 entities with Ontario. We've got nearly 1,900 megawatts of capacity with Ontario. But as I explained earlier, we're not using those entities to their full capacity only because the market is not there. The market need is not there. and therefore we're using the utilization factor of those entities is fairly low. In New York, we've got 17 megawatts, around 1,700 megawatts of capacity. And we're also using, well, we're in this case, we are using that capacity to this full extent. And actually in New York, the way the grid is operated is that we can deliver a maximum of 1,500 megawatts, 1,300 megawatts into New York, and because of operational constraints. However, the extra capacity that is available on the interties can be used to wheel power through New York and send it to neighboring areas. And this is what we try to do as much as possible, is to flow through New York and send power to New England to complement the sales that we do with our direct interties. I'll just touch briefly on New Brunswick. On New Brunswick, we do have about 1,000 megawatts of intertie capacity with that province. And as I said, the deliveries to New Brunswick are conditioned on the needs expressed by New NB Power. And so I would say that the interties are not necessarily used to their full capacity because of that. But in the same way as you use extra capacity in New York to send power to New England, we do use extra capacity in New Brunswick as well, because there is an intertie between New Brunswick and Maine. And we've got capacity, firm capacity reservation there that we use to send more power through New Brunswick to New England. If we look more specifically at the direct entities that we have with New England, we've got 3 entities basically. 2 of them are sinking into Vermont and are used to deliver firm energy to the Vermont utilities. We do have long-term contracts with them to supply energy until the mid 2030s. And so these entities are used mainly for that. There's a bit of extra capacity, and we're using it to do spot sales into the market. The other main highway between Quebec and New England is the last one that was Bill Gary talked about. So it's the Phase 2 project that brings power all the way from the James Bay area to Sandy Pond substation near Boston. And this entity as well is used to its full capacity every hour of the year. And so this is how we are sending our deliveries into New England. And when you look at the capacity that we have for New England, which is around 1,700 megawatts, and you can see that we need to use them to their full capacity to flow the 14 or 15 terawatt hours that we've been sending down to New England over the last few years. So basically the intertie capacity is maxed out in terms of deliveries from Quebec. Now, I'd like to talk about and to explain how the building of a new intertie will have an impact on the dispatch of generation in New England. And for that, I would like to run a little example here. It's a very simplified version of how do markets operate today. That's something that I work for the trading floor of Hydro-Québec, and this is what we do on a daily basis and on an hourly basis, is to schedule flows towards New England on the competitively priced market that is run by the New York ISO. So the regulation brought a situation where generation, or the generators, have to compete amongst themselves to supply the energy to the market that are being managed by the ISO and to meet demand at all time. This is a responsibility of the ISO to operate the grid in a reliable fashion and to dispatch the generation to make sure that there's always enough generation dispatched to meet the load. So I'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of how spot markets operate here. Again, I just want to repeat that this is a oversimplification of how markets operate, but that will give you an idea of the gist of it. So for a market, let's imagine that the only generation available in New England there would be 4 blocks of generation. Renewable generation up to 5,000 megawatts. There would be nuclear generation up to 3,000 megawatts. There would be natural gas generation up to 7,000 megawatts. And oil fuel generation up to 3,000 megawatts. The way the ISO meets its load is that on an hourly basis, it runs an auction, if you will. It does a forecast of how much generation or what its load will be and what how much generation will be needed. So let's take an example for one specific hour in one day. And this hour here, the little clock at the top here shows that it's hour actually start at 2 o'clock. In our jargon, it's hour ending 3. And the load for that hour is 15,500 megawatts. So a few hours before the beginning of the hour, the ISO turns to the different generators in its control area and asks for how much generation each generator is willing to supply and at what cost. In my example here, I have the renewable generators that are willing to supply 5,000 megawatts at a price that is close to zero. Why? Because generators are offering their megawatt hours on a short-term basis based on their short-term marginal cost. Short-term marginal cost is basically your fuel cost. And for hydropower or wind power, well, the fuel being wind and water, it still comes free from the sky or from the air. And therefore, the marginal generation cost is close to zero. We call those generators price taker generators, basically. Their cost is so low to generate 1 extra megawatt hour of energy when they can, that they will take the price set by other generators in the market. The nuclear generators usually in a generation stacking like the one in New England will come second because nuclear stations are expensive to build. They've got a lot of fixed costs, but in terms of their fuel cost, it's fairly low. Uranium is not necessarily very expensive when you buy it to produce electricity. So in our example here, the nuclear fleet would be willing to supply 3,000 megawatts at $50. Again, this is just an illustrative example. It's not a real price that we see in the market. Then we would see natural gas generation. It's a bit more expensive. The supply of natural gas, even though it has come down, the price has come down over recent years because of the shale boom. It's still a fair price to supply the gas. So in my example here, I put 7,000 megawatts available at $30. And then beyond that, if you need more generation, then you've got the oil generation that could be dispatched. And we have in my example 3,000 megawatts available. But those generators would be asking for a higher price, even though if the price of oil has come down recently. I mean, oil generation is more expensive than gas generation. And in my example here, I've got 3,000 megawatts available at $45. So once the ISO has received all those offers, it will dispatch the generation on a least cost basis, meaning dispatching the generation, first the generation that is the least expensive. And so in our case here, we need 15,500 megawatts. And I should just point out to the little graph in the middle of the slide here. What you've got here is that when you stack this generation or the different types of generation available, when you stack it on a graph, you've got here their capacity here, like the renewable energy. You've got 5,000 megawatts available at a price of zero. I've just got a line here on zero. And then you've got the next block of 3,000 megawatts at $30. The next block of 7,000 at $30. And you've got finally the last 3,000 megawatt block at $45 here. So you've got somehow a supply curve. And what will happen is that the ISO will dispatch the generation, as I said, using the least expensive one first. So to meet the 15,500 megawatts of this example, we will get the 5,000 megawatts from the renewable. We will get the 3,000 megawatts from the nuclear. We'll dispatch the entire natural gas fleet as well. So altogether, we've got 15,000 megawatts here, but we need an extra 500 megawatts. And that 500 megawatts will come from the oil fleet here. And that's how we're going to have a supply of generation that will meet the demand curve here. And that's what you have on the illustration here, the intersection of the demand curve, which is vertical here, and of the supply curve represented by those boxes. So for hour ending 3, starting at 2 o'clock, what you'll have is that you'll have all this generation being dispatched, including the 500 megawatts from the oil fleet, to meet, and that will meet the total demand that is required. Now the question is, okay, so what will be the price for the market there? So the market clearing price will be set by the last megawatt that you'll dispatch for that hour. And in our case here, the last megawatt is being dispatched comes from the oil fleet, and it is dispatched at the price of $45. So the market clearing price for that hour for the whole market will be $45. So each generator will receive $45, and everybody who consumes electricity during that hour will pay $45 for the megawatt hour part of their bill. So this is just normal supply and demand, where the marginal unit sets the price for the whole market. So now that we've said that, I just want to illustrate the impact that a extra or new injection of over 1,000 megawatts of clean generation from Hydro-Québec on NESEC could have on the market. And this is what would happen here, is that you build a new line and you sign contracts so to provide clean energy every hour of the year. And to do so, because you've got an obligation to be dispatched every hour of the year, according to your contract, then we'll be offering our megawatts at a price that will ensure that we'll be dispatched at all times. So we'll become price takers, like the renewable energy, the 5,000 megawatt block that I talked about in the previous example. So you'll be adding basically to your stacking curve an extra 1,000 megawatt that will be price taker here. That will displace all the generation to the right. In my example here, that means that each box is shifting by 1,000 megawatts to the right. So if for the same hour you need to dispatch 15,500 megawatts, what happens when you've got a new import that becomes price taker? That means that the intersection between the supply curve and the demand curve is no more at $45, but it is at $30 because you have pushed out the oil generation of the dispatch. And now the new marginal unit is a natural gas unit at $30. So the price will come down to $30 in that example. And also you will not dispatch the oil generation. And this is how you will have a positive impact on greenhouse gas emission by just making sure that you use less and less greenhouse gas emitting generation. And you can see actually that if you were running that scenario in an hour where the load was lower, around 11,000 megawatts or just beneath that, well, the injection of the 1,000 megawatts may be enough to for that hour to not to need any of the carbon emitting generation here, because again, you would have enough generation with the renewable, the new import, and the nuclear to meet demand. And again, the equilibrium would be set at a place where only the clean energy and the renewable energy or low emitting energy would be dispatched, and you do away with all the carbon emitting energy. So again, this is a oversimplified example of how markets operate, but again, the dynamic of how the dispatch is being decided on a hourly basis and even in real time is such that the injection of new imports coming from Quebec that would become price takers, that would be baseload generation, that would be flowing every hour of the year. This is how it would bring a positive impact on the market, both in terms of reduction of GHG emissions, in terms of price for the energy in the market, and also, well, you know, as I mentioned before, because of reliability issues that have been created with the over-reliance on natural gas, new clean imports, baseload imports from Quebec would also participate in bringing a positive impact to that problem. So that's what I had for you at this time. I believe that we are now moving to the question version, so I'll pass it back to you, Ben.